Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well. This week we will start a new learning module on gifted education programming. It's really important that we have the learning module about gifted education being a right or a privilege first, because one of the main goals I have in that module is that you understand how gifted education differs from state to state, but also from district to district and even school to school. So keep that in mind as we look into gifted education programming, because you have to remember that it's not guaranteed that all schools or states or even districts are doing the exact same thing in terms of serving students who are identified as gifted and talented. When we look into gifted education programming, there are two main different types of services that we provide. The first is acceleration, and the second is enrichment. Acceleration is basically moving through content at a more quick pace. If you think of the option for some students to grade skip or to potentially say you start in first grade, you finish first grade, and instead of doing second, you go immediately to third. That's known as grade skipping. That's one of our most probably well-known forms of acceleration, and also some of the most extreme form of acceleration as well. So think about acceleration as if you're like accelerating in a car. You're just going through the curriculum at a faster pace. Beyond acceleration, we have enrichment. Enrichment is not as much about going more quickly, it's more about going more deeply. So when we think about enrichment, we are providing more depth and more complexity to the content that is being studied. A lot of gifted education programs in the elementary level tend to be more enrichment focused. For example, if we have a pull-out, say once a week, the students often are working on an enrichment curriculum that is designed to go deeper into content and really challenge them to engage in that critical thinking. So for acceleration, think more quick, like accelerating in the car, and for enrichment, think deeper, really digging deep into what's actually going on, critical thinking and engaging. Now, before we go any farther, I want to make it very clear that acceleration and enrichment are not opposite ends of a continuum. They are not opposites of each other. They're kind of two schools of thought, and most gifted education programs combine acceleration and enrichment. So be careful not to make that really common misunderstanding that it's one or the other. Typically, it's a combination of both. In terms of enrichment, one important thing to remember is alignment. So a common problem I've seen when doing some consulting work with gifted education is I'll look into the gifted pull-out service where the students have, say, 2 or 3 hours a week of gifted education services, and they're doing an enrichment curriculum, which is great, but oftentimes that curriculum has nothing to do with anything they're studying in their traditional classroom. And this proposes actually a pretty large problem because students see that enriched learning as extra, and they see it as something that's not really connected to the actual content. They really don't do well applying those critical thinking skills beyond that enrichment classroom setting. So in terms of providing enriched curriculum, we want to make sure we are enriching the same content that we are addressing within the traditional grade level classroom. A common mistake I've seen with acceleration is the misunderstanding that acceleration just means more. So oftentimes I'll see opportunities for gifted students to say, well, they finished these 20 math word problems, let's give them 20 more and see how quickly they can go through them. Well, in really that case, you're not accelerating, you're just requiring the student to do extra work. It's more of the same thing. Versus acceleration, we're really going through the content at an accelerated pace. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview of those two schools of thought. And again, they are not exclusive of one another, but typically when we speak of gifted education services, we start that conversation by saying this is primarily an acceleration model or accelerated model, and this is primarily an enrichment model. And then from there, we'll kind of talk about how we have a combination of the two. Those are two important vocabulary terms to think about for this week. As we look into this case study, I will upfront say it's a little bit more detailed than most of our case studies, so be sure that you allow yourself plenty of time to look through it. Basically, what's happening is an all too common experience. We have a gifted education teacher who's been on the job for one day, and all of a sudden he is asked to give a presentation of gifted education services to his district. So this is pretty common, and what I think Mr. Draper, the main character here in our case study, does well is he works really hard to give an overview of what the district concerns to be gifted. So how do they define gifted in the first place? What is the mission statement of this program? And also, what are the programming goals? If you read through Mr. Draper's presentation, you can see that he's being very clear in what the gifted education services look like within his district. Remember, this is his district. We don't know necessarily what's happening in terms of other districts. As we learned last week, there's a lot of issues with accountability. But the fact that Mr. Draper is presenting is a good sign. This means that they're trying to bring more accountability to that district and hopefully others around him. So your challenge this week is to read your library content materials, watch your videos. Again, start with whichever type of content you feel most comfortable with. From there, really intently look at the NAGC programming standards. So if I were to print one document from this week, I would highly recommend that you print out those standards. In response to a lot of the lack of accountability, the National Association for Gifted Children put out these programming standards for quality gifted education services. So this is what we are going to be judging Mr. Draper's work based on. So I would highly encourage you to print out those standards once you have reviewed them, because for your case study this week, your discussion prompt is to really investigate the best practices that you can see in Mr. Draper's study. So he's presenting to the district, this is what our gifted education program looks like. And up front, I will say it's not perfect, but there are a lot of good opportunities here. He does a great job defining giftedness at the start, even stating the mission and the programming goals. So hint, hint on a couple of things. But it will take you some time to really analyze his gifted education program and point out some of the best practices. As you point out the best practices in his program, I am requiring you to definitely refer to those NAGC standards. So I do want you to be as specific as Standard 1 or Standard 2.1. So I really need to see that you have looked at those standards and you're applying them to his gifted education proposal. So that should be your main source, but you really need to be looking through all of the content this week. It's a little heavier in my opinion, so that you have a clear understanding of what these program models can look like. And again, I just want to stress that it's not one or the other. Oftentimes, gifted education services will differ, and typically they always involve some form of enrichment and some form of acceleration. So, just to be clear, this week we are starting our investigation of different programming models for gifted education services. Your assignment is to do your discussion board post. That discussion board post is about Mr. Draper. He's doing a presentation to his district about the gifted education services that the district provides. Through the NAGC standards and your other library content, I want you to really investigate that case study and discuss the best practices that you see in Mr. Draper's work. As always, I'll be looking for your initial post by Friday and your responses to your classmates' post by Sunday. You have noticed that I did input interim grades. So the way that our Blackboard is set up, however, you can always see what your grade average is. So make sure that you're inputting your work on time and not forgetting to do simple things like responding to your classmates' posts. If you have any questions, my door is always open, and I'm always willing to schedule a video conference or phone call if that works better. Just make sure you reach out to me via email first. Okay, have a wonderful week, and I hope you are all doing well.